Ancient Greek comedy was not nearly as developed as ancient Greek tragedy, which we still think of as the standard. Tragedy became debased in the Roman period, but comedy continued to develop as it moved forward and in fact raised to much greater heights in the Roman period than it had been in the Greek period. So we want to look a little bit at ancient Roman playwrights, and particularly about the two great comedians, and think about their lives and works. The first of these is Plautus. Titus Maccius Plautus is his full Roman name, but this name is obviously a stage name, a pseudonym. Titus is an everyday name in Rome, sort of like Bob is in our time, but Maccius is a word which simply means clown, stage clown, and Plautus, the name by which we best know him, means flat-footed. So the whole name, Bob the Flat-Footed Clown, is not really meant as any kind of realistic moniker, but some kind of stage joke. As a result, we know very little about him as a real person because we can't tie this information to any real person that lived back in this period. All we know is the stage name. People often took stage names to protect their families and, in fact, to keep their real biographies from being discovered throughout history, well into the contemporary period, as a matter of fact. So this is not all that odd. Plautus is the earliest of the great Latin writers, the earliest writer of literature who used the Latin language, and he was born only 68 years after Aristotle died. I mean, he was within a century of Aristotle, he was up and working. There's a legend that he was a stagehand or a carpenter before he became a playwright, that he was hanging around the theater and just sitting around backstage thought, well, I can do that. But that's really just about all we know about him. We know a lot about his work, however. Interestingly, we've had some discussions about how plays and manuscripts carried over from the ancient world, talking about the Poetics in particular as being one of the worst preserved manuscripts from ancient times. But the undoubted winner is the works of Plautus, which we know from only one manuscript, and that manuscript is a palimpsest. That is, it's a manuscript that has been erased once and written over the top. You can see a photograph here and what looks like a double image, but it's really not a double image. It was just very poorly erased in the first place, and then a text written over the top of it. But that poorly erased text is the text of the 20 known Plautus plays. This is the only source we have for them. So we have more, meaning 20 plays of Plautus, than we have of any other ancient dramatist. But we know them only by the slimmest of chances that somehow this weird palimpsest was preserved. So sort of all due to a monk who was bad at erasing is what it might come down to. These are the 20 plays that we have left, the surviving canon of Plautus, but we know names of many more lost plays, this list here. But they tend to fall into a very generic plot. We're told that this plot is a pattern invented by Menander in New Comedy, and Plautus simply imported it over into Latin. In this generic plot, a young man falls hopelessly in love with a virtuous but usually enslaved young woman, a virginal hooker, about to be sold by a new owner far away. The young man enlists the aid of a clever servant who has to surmount numerous obstacles, including the blocking figure, usually the young man's conservative old father, in order to get the young man and the young woman together. The father is generally withholding money, but in some cases is himself a rival for the young woman, or, in very few plays, both of those things are true. Standing in the way, also antagonists are a variety of pimps, parasites, that is, people who live trying to get extra money out of the rich by trickery, and a general lack of intelligence on the part of the freeborn compared to the very clever slaves. In these plays, of course, they're comedies, all ends happily. In Plautus, often strictly by coincidence. Often the incidents of the play have almost nothing to do with the final outcome. We're going to take a quick cruise through the canon here. Amphitryon, alphabetically, about the seduction of Amphitryon's wife by the god Jupiter, who seduces her by turning himself into the shape of Amphitryon. The play gets its happy ending because Amphitryon's wife gives birth to twins, as it turns out. One of those is Amphitryon's son and the other Jupiter's son, and that son turns out to be Hercules. This is Plautus's only play on a mythological subject, but it's a play that has been rewritten numerous times. There's a play, a French play called Amphitryon 58, which is supposed to be the 58th version of it. It was written shortly after World War II. Here's a picture of it in a 1935 German musical production. Asinoria, title means a bunch of asses, in which a man enlists the aid of his two clever servants to trick his wife, who is the owner or the runner of a brothel, out of her fortune in order to buy one of the prostitutes as a wife for his son. The trick works, but in the end, the husband and son end up being betrayed and their plot is foiled. It's one of the few plays in which the ending is dubiously unhappy. The Pot of Gold is a play about a miser. In fact, it became the basis of Molière's play, The Miser. It's an incomplete play, but we know how it ends because there are some summaries of how the plot resolved extant from the period. But there is a reconstructed version of it by E.F. Watling that is now available out in Penguin Classic editions. Bacchides, two sisters named Bacchus, is a play in which two young men, with the help of their servants, hope to find a way to buy these beloved sisters, both being sold into prostitution. What a surprise, it turns out okay. This is based on a play by Menander, whose title we know, The Double Deceivers. Captivi, the captives, is the most interesting of all of the Plautus plays. It's an outlier. It's not really a comedy at all. It's rather serious. It's a play in which a prisoner of war is sold into slavery to a very oppressive owner. But in the end, after the owner decides that the slave is not good enough and sells him into even worse conditions of slavery where he undoubtedly will die, it turns out that the slave is the long-lost but natural-born son of this oppressive owner, and the owner wishes that he had treated his slave son better. Cassina is a play in which the blocking figure, the father, sends his son out of the country on a trumped-up errand so that he can keep the son from marrying the slave girl, Cassina. The old man actually planned to keep Cassina as a mistress for himself, so he's going to marry Cassina to his own slave, Olympia, and keep her as a secret concubine, but a couple of clever servants working together thwart his plot. You may wonder about how many references there are in Roman drama to these long-lost children. But as it turns out, there was a custom in Roman times that all mothers of newborn children had to go out into public and set their child down, um, and uh, expose it, it was called, and see if it was claimed. That is, a father acknowledged a child to be his own by going to this public ceremony and claiming the child. The way adoption actually worked in this period is that the father agreed not to go to the ceremony or agreed not to claim his own child, but the mother privately arranged for someone else, because if no father came forward, then anyone could claim the child. And so she would, the way that Roman adoption worked was for a child to be exposed and a different father or a different family to claim the child. But in cases of illegitimate children, cases of unwanted children, the father simply refused to claim them, even when he knew well that they were his. And sometimes those children were then picked up by someone who adopted them for the purposes of turning them into a slave. Because this practice was near universal, it really did turn out that in a lot of cases in everyday life in Rome, adult children were reunited with their natural families. Families that for one reason or another gave them up originally, but mothers and fathers managed to find their children much later. This is all an odd background, but it explains why these discovery plots on long-lost children are so common in Roman plays. In Sistarella, a merchant recovers, which means small box, a casket. A merchant recovers his child by means of signs, trinkets that had been placed in a casket with the baby. These signs are also very, very common throughout Roman plays, and again, tended to be cases from real life where a lot of people who did expose their children did leave some sort of item on them, where for hope that somewhere later the child could be identified and reclaimed. There's an interesting modern version of this called Easy Virtue, which you can find at the address on the slide there. The weevil, Curculio, is a stock parasite character, as weevils are parasites that get into the flower. This is a character who lives off by tricking elderly or wealthy people out of their money. And in this case, this parasite is employed to assist a young man to trick a wealthy soldier out of his money so that the young man can buy a beloved slave girl. The trick almost works, but in the end the soldier discovers the ruse. But in discovering the ruse, he discovers that this slave girl is his long-lost freeborn sister. So he can't marry her because it's his sister, and she's freeborn, so she can marry whoever she pleases, which turns out to be the young man. Epidicus is about a slave that deceives his master, the master's son, the master's wife, and many others, because he has the good sense to see that what all of them want is not very good for them. He successfully acquires a slave that the son is in love with, but discovers that the son has already moved along. As it turns out, however, the slave that he had picked out for the son is the long-lost daughter of the household, and the son happily marries the girl that he'd moved on to, but Epidicus is freed for finding the master's daughter. The Twin Menechmi is the play that Shakespeare used as the basis for his play Comedy of Errors, about a pair of twins separated at birth, but coincidentally arrive in the same place at the same time in their adult life when they're looking for each other. Lots of mistaken identity and silliness involved in this particular play, but in the end, a clever servant figures it all out, and they are put back together, and the servant is freed. Mercator, the merchant, is a play in which the title character plots to steal away a slave girl which his son actually loves. Uh, the slave employs the help of an indignant wife, and the merchant is thwarted, and the son gets the girl in the end, and, what a surprise, the slave is freed for his assistance. Throughout these plays, there's often a character named Miles Gloriosus, which is kind of a character type, just like there's clever servants and silly sons and blocking fathers. There is this braggart soldier. This play, Miles Gloriosus, is often translated into English under the title Major Blowhard. This is a soldier, shows up in the play bragging of his accomplishments, but it turns out he's really kind of a coward. He is flattered by a parasite character that compliments him endlessly, and then through a set of highly contrived tricks is swindled out of a slave girl, and the slave girl is reunited with her true love, and it's almost always accomplished, as it is in this play, with a clever slave. Mostellaria means literally the little ghost, but it's usually translated as the haunted house, in which a play in which a young man's been living a great life while his father's out of town, spending his money left and right, but and borrowing a lot of additional money in order to buy the slave girl that he loves. But when his father unexpectedly shows back up in town, in order to keep him from finding out what's happening, the son pretends that the house is haunted and keeps his father outside. This is one of those plays that the resolution turns out to be completely unrelated to the rest of the plot. A friend just pays off the son's debts. In the play The Persian, Persa, a master is out of town, and while he's out of town, his clever slave wants to buy his girlfriend, who's also a slave, from her pimp. In this case, sort of the son character and the slave character are combined into a single character. In order to get the money to do so, the slave invents an elaborate scheme in which a freeborn friend pretends to be a Persian, and there's a moneylender involved who's eventually cheated out of his money and allows the slave to build up enough money to buy his own girlfriend. Poenulus is about a Punic, that is somebody from Carthage, a young man stolen from Carthage in his youth and later adopted into a Roman family, has fallen in love with a young woman who, along with her sister, was likewise stolen from Carthage but sold into slavery. A clever slave attempts to trick the pimp out of the two sisters, but in the end the father turns up from Carthage to claim the young girls, is reunited with his family, and therefore identifying that they are not actually slaves, they're freeborn women who were stolen, and they are freed, and she is allowed to marry her rich boyfriend. Pseudolus is a play that we're going to look at in much greater detail in a full separate slideshow, but I just want to make a quick note that this play is the basis for Stephen Sondheim's musical A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. Rudens means the rope. It's a play in which the slave girl is stolen from her parents by pirates, but is reunited with her father many, many years later, ironically, when the girl's pimp tries to pimp her to her own father. This is a very thin plot premise. The real interest of the play is in the interaction of the clever slaves and their masters. A recent translation called The Storm is available from Peter Oswald, written in 2005. Trimimus, Three Sums of Money, is a very complicated plot that has to do with a loyal friend guarding over a merchant's home while the merchant travels abroad, but the merchant's son is very wasteful and wants to spend a ton of money. The son has a wonderful name, Lesbonicus. Um, the clever friend is forced 3 separate times to resort to trickery to obtain or retain the money in order to keep the estate intact until his friend gets home. But in the end, it does all work out. Truculentus is a slave's name, title character, but this play really has very little to do with him. It's mostly about a house of prostitutes who are all busy tricking gullible men out of their money in a variety of ways. It's an extraordinarily cynical play, not so popular through most of history, but it's become much more popular in recent times because it, again, has a sort of feminist edge, sort of. This is a word cloud created out of students asked to read Plautus's plays and then state the 1 or 2 or 3 words that they remember most. You'll notice that right at the center of this is clever slave, which is a good way of, clever slaves are really at the center of the plots of these plays, but also of Plautus's plays, but also a lot of prostitute characters, sometimes some twins, lots of situational comedy, slapstick. You get a sense just by reading through this word cloud what is going on inside these plays. We want to turn our attention now to a later playwright named Terence, Publius Terentius Afer. Weirdly enough, this once again is a pseudonym, or at least it's not his real name, it's a name given to him. Publius is a name that literally means freed slave. He was a slave and was given his freedom. Terentius means that he was a slave of the Terentius family, and Afer means that he came from Africa. As one cynical commentator says, this is not really his name, it's a receipt. We're not sure exactly when he was born. We only have 2 sources, one that says he was born in 185 BCE and one a decade later in 195 BCE. But in whichever case, he died rather young. We know that he was a slave of Terentius Lucanus, who was a Roman senator, quite a famous man, who educated him and then freed him later. The Afer in his name tells us that he was born in Africa, but and we know that he was a slave captured in Africa. But those 2 facts don't definitively tell us what his ethnicity was, because slavery was not an ethnic matter back in ancient times in the way that it was in America. But there still is a lot of speculation, as our textbook points out, that he may have been the earliest great figure of Western literature that was a black playwright, a black writer of literature, that is, someone of African descent. And he's still quite an inspirational figure on the thought that he probably was of African descent. That is an example of someone who, given the same privileges, a good education, managed to have the same level of accomplishments as the freeborn or well-known white contemporaries. He died very young, and he wrote only 6 plays, but they were all extremely popular because he had this wealthy patron. They may have come to attention and been printed early, but we have lots and lots of copies of them, the exact opposite of Plautus, which we know from only one and very poor source. We have 650 or so different medieval manuscripts that contain all or part of these plays. And these were the first plays revived after the Dark Ages into the Renaissance. Terence was very, very popular. The plays actually seem quite strange to us now. Um, they're beautifully written in Latin, and they often have very lovely and clever one-liners, but the overall plots are kind of strange. In Andrea, the girl from Andros, after much complication with the help of a clever slave, a young man marries his beloved, a girl from Andros. This is sort of the most straightforward, almost Plautian, Plautus-like of all of Terence's plays. But the complications now seem odd to us. Nothing compared to the rest of the canon, though. In the mother-in-law, the plot is that a newly married woman is hiding her pregnancy from her mother-in-law, who's clever enough to figure it out, so that her husband will not discover that she's been raped. The husband would instantly know this because he has not consummated the marriage with her. He has been off pursuing his passions elsewhere. The so-called happy ending of this play is that when the conditions of the rape are finally revealed, the husband recognizes that he was the assailant, and that he was overcome with passion, he says, and for this woman, and in this circumstance where he didn't realize who he's raping, but he was wild for her, and he accepts her and the son that is born once he realizes it. There are some of these signs, tokens involved in all of this recognition. We don't exactly think of this as a happy ending, but in Roman times, of course, and in fact, even in parts of the world today, rape is still blamed on the rape victim instead of on the rapist. And one of the few ways that women in these very oppressive societies can escape the stigma of rape is if the rapist accepts them, that they are eventually married to the rapist. The Self-Tormentor is a play about a severe father who sends his son away to war so that he won't marry unwisely, but then realizes that he's put his son's life in danger simply in order to impose his own will on his son. But this play does turn out fine in the end. You'll see a quote printed across the bottom there in Latin that we'll return to later. It's one of the most famous quotes of Terence's work. Phormio, the title character of this play, is not a slave, but he is a character who has no job. He simply lives by his wits. And in this play, he helps two young men secure their beloved girlfriends, one who's a slave and one is a woman who has no dowry, respectively. He tricks some people out of money in order to pay off the fathers who will then be happy about how their sons marry. In the play The Eunuch, there's a central plot in which a young man falls in love with a courtesan, Thais, and he arranges for a eunuch to be delivered to her as a present, but this man's younger brother pretends to be the eunuch so that he can get close to this slave girl that he is in love with. And the brother becomes the girl's guard, and then he rapes her. But in the end, both brothers, I mean, again, hard for us to take this as a happy ending, but both brothers end up marrying a girl that they love, including the rapist to this girl that he raped. Her feeling doesn't seem overly important. Adelphoi means the brothers. There are actually two sets of brothers in this play. An older generation, a man and his opposite tempered brother, each raised one of a pair of sons. It's one of those cases of exposure where a man claimed only one of his two sons, but arranged for his brother to claim the other one so that the cost of raising children is more evenly spread. So there's actually, two generations of two brothers, one good and one bad in each case. In this play, it turns out that the good-tempered, nice brothers, by circumstances, look very bad for a long time, but it's revealed in the end that they're not bad. And their bad brothers kind of come around in the end because of their good example. So here's a word cloud about Terence. Again, students who've read the play ask to respond with a few words about what they remember. You'll notice the big word right in the center of this, the big central question for our time, all of these rape plots and how we are supposed to, in our time, accept rape plots. These plays had fallen out of favor in the 20th century, but they are now coming back into favor, not so much because they are funny, but because we live in a pretty rape culture time that is re-examining these rape cultures, re-examining some of our attitudes and thinking about where they came from historically, and Terence's plays are very illuminating in this regard. But you'll see many, many other words that the students associate with these plays. Just a handful of quotes from Terence, because this is what he's really famous for. His plots seem a little strained, but he has these wonderful one-liners. The one I pointed out to you earlier in Latin translates, "I am human. I consider nothing human to be foreign to me." But here's some more. You might well ask the rules of madness as those of love. Who knows? He is the originator of the quote, "Moderation in all things, too much of anything is bad." Where there's life, there's hope, there's still possibility, he says. And maybe his most popular quote in schools, "Children should be taught not with force, but with love."